Welcome to a very special episode of Closing Night Theatre Therapy, the podcast hosted by me, Susie Rong, theatre critic at susiegoc.com, and my wonderful co-host Nate Edmondson, composer and sound designer. Today we have the extraordinary pleasure of presenting to you a panel discussion with artistic directors from several of Sydney's most important independent theatre companies. Now, a few days before recording was meant to take place, I was informed that I had to be in Melbourne and would have to miss the session altogether, which is incredibly disappointing, of course. But Nate was there to keep everything under control. This was our little chat a couple of days before the day of recording. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Nate, to have to leave you alone with these powerhouses.
That's okay, Susie. Hopefully I can keep them under control by my lonesome.
Well, there's no question that they're going to have so much to talk about. What do you think are the main areas that you'd be interested in covering?
I'd definitely be interested in talking about reforms to the industry as to how the independent sector is funded and supported from a government and private level. I would love to see discussion about diversity and about how the independent scene is striving towards correcting some of the long-standing cultural issues that theatre has ingrained in it. And I would love to talk about mobility in the independent sector. And we've discussed a lot in the last few weeks in our podcast, the problem that we have in Sydney in particular with artists being trapped in the independent sector and unable to kind of move beyond it, and what sort of impact that's having on the risks that are being taken, on the work that's being presented, and on the future of these artists that are making this work and taking those risks.
Yeah, I hope you'll be able to get them to talk about what they identify as a pressing need for theatre makers, their community, and also for the audiences, where they want to take the audiences to for the near future and further afield. And also I'm interested in asking them about what they would like to see less of. I think we're very good at talking about what we would like to see, but sometimes I think it is helpful to talk about what not to see as much.
Yeah.
The things that we've been repeating, some of the stories that we've been repeating too much, some of the statements that we keep making. How do we progress beyond that?
And we've put together a panel that is quite interesting and diverse in the sense that we have panellists that represent an older generation of theatre makers. We have panellists that represent a very diverse and more recent generation of theatre makers, and all who work in very different theatres and very different places in the industry. So it'd be interesting to hear how they share those stories with each other and what they have to say and debate, hopefully. There's some rigorous discussion between them all.
Yeah, I hope it's a good representation of who we are as a city, because, they all come from different sort of backgrounds, but they're all Sydney people. So hopefully through this discussion we can find out more about ourselves, which is the whole point of this, really.
Hello listeners, today we're in studio with a very special panel show edition of Closing Night Theatre Therapy. Susie Rong is not here today, unfortunately, so it's just yours truly hosting tonight. And in studio with us, we have 5 guests who are all artistic directors / producers of independent theatre companies. And we'll be having a panel discussion with them today about what it is to make independent theatre. So joining us in studio, we have Kim Hardwick of White Box Theatre.
Hello, Nate. Hello, all.
We have Jeremy Waters of Outhouse Theatre Company.
Hello, Nate. Hi, everyone. So good to be here.
We have Kate Gaul of Siren Theatre Company.
Hello.
Ayeesha Ash of Blackbird's Creative Arts Company.
G'day.
And Dino Dimitriadis of Apocalypse Theatre Company.
Hello, thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming in. I'm going to start with some questions directed to you as individuals that I think are kind of pertinent to your experience. And then we can open that up into a group discussion. If anyone else has strong feelings on any of the topics, feel free to chime in. All right, I might start with you, Ms. Gaul.
Thank you, Nate.
Good call. Good call.
As a more experienced director and producer, you don't put on plays purely for the sake of it or for the pursuit of a greater career ambition, but because you have an inherent interest in the play and a belief that it's worth putting on. That's quite different to how a lot of younger directors feel that they have to work in the industry, where there's a lot of perceived pressure to put on a lot of work in order to make yourself visible, build up a portfolio in the interests of having a greater career and someone coming from the main stage sector, I guess, and picking you up. How did you come to reach a place in your career where you're comfortable not having to chase that goal anymore?
This is a great question, and it's one that always comes up. Having passed through the mainstream like a can of beans, been there, done that. When I left drama school, when I came to Sydney and I left drama school, I did the directing course at NIDA. I realised very quickly it was very important for me to create a body of work that spoke to my interests, aesthetic, political, and very practical, I guess. And although I've always worked as a freelance director, the work that I do with Siren very much reflects my interests, whether they're aesthetic, political or personal. So I think creating a body of work is a really important thing to do. What's not important is trying to imitate the mainstream. I think that's very dangerous for independent directors and producers at any level. And it's certainly not what I did. And I think that my body of work probably reflects that I've always chosen work that would probably never get on in Sydney because we just live in this very small place. The work that I've chosen has been about the challenges of perhaps the content, the challenges of wanting to work with a particular writer or a particular actor, and then it might go down the list with working with other creatives and bringing those voices to the stage, as well as developing a really vital theatre audience for things that I want to put in front of them. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to be asked to do that for another company, but it may mean that I'm not. When I went to drama school, we were told, it doesn't matter what you do now, it's what happens to you in 5 years' time. And I will say that 5 years almost to the day of me entering drama school, I had my first gig upstairs at Belvoir Street. So maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in my case, but that certainly worked for me. And then what followed on was a series of, engagements in mainstream theatre companies, which were really great. And I guess now I'm at the other end of that where, because people become fashionable, they go in and out of fashion. But my sort of passion and quest for making work hasn't been diminished. In fact, if anything, it's stronger than ever. And I have other things that I want to do now in the theatre. I'd have to quote Shakespeare, which I know, and dead white male, he may not be in fashion, but to thine own self be true. That will help you get through the sleepless nights, the empty bank balance, and the empty houses.
Well, bank balance is a big part of it. And I guess it's easier to feel comfortable producing work more selectively if you're able to pay your bills and you're not having to rely on that work as your sole income.
Yeah, of course.
I'll open this question up to the whole panel as just maybe a real kind of quick fire thing. For each of you, is theatre making or related pursuits like teaching in the arts, events work, acting work, advertising, that sort of stuff, is that a full-time career for you, or do you have other jobs on the side that help pay your bills? Dino?
Yeah, for the good part of the last sort of 6 to 7 years, it's been, if not directly in theatre, events related or producing related or festivals related. So I have very much circled in this world for the last X amount of time.
I have 2 jobs and I study. I'm at uni as well. Yeah, but I've recently been able to be more selective with my work and say that I'm not going to do any work that doesn't relate to my artistic practice, which has been really great and also a bit stressful. Yeah.
Yeah, everything I do is related to my practice.
Yes, everything I do is related to practice. I do have an ushering job on the side at the Seymour Centre, which I actually refuse to give up because it's actually quite lovely being that little invisible person and seeing how people react to shows.
Well, you work alongside quite a few well-known theatre identities at that particular job.
Very much so.
How about you, Joe?
I'm a bit the same. I've been sort of making a living out of it for the last few years, but it took me a while. It took me a long time. It took me into probably my late 30s, I'd say, before I could sort of cast off the call centre yoke or the hospo thing. And then, it's pretty multifaceted. It's all sorts of bits and pieces. It's producing, it's voiceover, it's commercial work, it's a little bit of teaching. It's just lots of bits and bobs, but it's certainly all related to my arts practice, certainly, yeah. And it's really nice when you get to that point, because that's when you're starting out, you kind of go, oh, I'd like to be making a living out of that. And when you find yourself, oh, I'm kind of doing that. It's nice. It's a nice feeling. And there's nothing wrong with those jobs too, like what Kim was saying. No. And I think David Lynch said something about that. Like he said, find a casual job that you don't hate that will allow you to, do what you truly love. You got a pretty good life there.
There's also a flexibility in having multiple income streams. There's a very practical flexibility to being able to slot out a couple of times a year when you're in rehearsal, or even in my world with the jobs that I've been able to maintain that have largely been related to my practice and this industry. Flexibility is really important.
Yeah, and they're about. Yeah, you can find those jobs.
Dino, I might shoot a question to you next.
God, here we go.
So something we've spoken a little bit about on this podcast previously is about the idea of queer sensibility to theatre making and a local queer voice in theatre, and whether Sydney has perhaps been lacking in that, particularly compared to Melbourne. So as a queer theatre maker whose work often centres on queer storytelling or reimagining work through a queer lens, how important do you think it is for Sydney to have its own queer theatre scene?
I think it's vital, and I think it's vital that we have queer work on stage. I'm excited. I think we're seeing a strong growth in queer work on the Sydney stage. But there's also that challenge with any sort of body of work where building the skill set around it and getting artists to hone their craft around it is a process. For me, a queer theatre is both a lens, and that's also partly to do with content, but it's also about an aesthetic. And it does take strong collaborations and time to develop that aesthetic, to actually understand that it's a way of looking at the world. But like most things, I think, in the industry, for a queer theatre to exist healthily, it has to be across the board. There has to be a nurturing of queer playwrights. And that doesn't just mean the dominant gay voices that we get. It's about now moving into new conversations and actually reflecting the experiences of the communities I spend time in, which even as a queer theatre maker, I don't see on stage my people. I don't see the diversity of queer communities on stage. And across the board with the directors and the designers and actors who feel comfortable to be able to express that part of themselves as well.
Do you think that perhaps that's also partly to do with the fact that queer culture is becoming more accepted, more understood, and also there's a lot more representation of queer culture in the media? Do you think that as it becomes more understood and more ingrained into our culture, it's harder for people to feel that they need to step up and make work that works within that kind of queer lens?
I think in some ways the visibility has made it a little bit easier, but I think now is the time when I feel it's most urgent to be making queer work. I think that a lot of people have become complacent on where queer rights are and where our communities are. And there've obviously been significant advances and things like same-sex marriage and all that. But the way the world is now, I think it's urgent to be making that work.
Why does Sydney have such a mild voice when it comes to queer theatre compared to Melbourne?
Two things. I think the structures in place haven't traditionally nurtured queer voices, the curatorial structures, the administrative structures, all of that. And it has really been left to largely the independent voice and the independent sector to drive that work. But there is also, I think, an expectation of a certain quality product in Sydney with theatre. We have a very strong independent sector at the moment. I think everyone's, making brilliant, strong work with high production values and all that. And there is this culture where I certainly feel where a certain degree of rigour is expected in that work. And so there are a lot of wonderful queer voices, but to be able to have the skill set to be able to give the work visibility and also to be growing that skill set is not often nurtured in Sydney.
Well, that's another issue that has increasingly, in fact, I think it's come up on every single podcast episode that we've had so far, which is really interesting. And I do think it's probably one of the most pressing issues that the independent theatre sector faces in Sydney, which is this issue of the lack of upward mobility in our industry and the ability to make pathways into the main stage sector. And so I wanted to ask all of you, for the whole panel, how often do representatives of main stage theatre companies come to see your work that you're aware of?
I think it depends. Some shows, depending on the content, depending on the actors involved, you'll get a few, which is always nice. You always feel good if you feel like your flagship companies are checking in on the work in our ecosystem that you're involved in. And other shows, not much at all. So I think it It does kind of vary, to be honest. And it also depends on the company and who's running the company. I think certain companies are quite represented, and you can count on seeing certain artistic directors at your shows on a fairly regular basis, and they're going to make an effort. Other companies, I don't think have ever seen one of our shows.
Yeah, I think it varies enormously. And I think it varies mostly on the actors that are involved, to be honest. I don't think they're coming along to see my work. I think they're coming along to see maybe an emerging actor or an actor where there may be a role for them, next year in something or other. So it does vary. And I have to say that really pisses me off. I think that... how should I say this nicely? Maybe I can't.
Yeah, say it truthfully.
I think that there is a... when you are the flag head or when you are the head of a company, I feel that it's your responsibility to see what theatre is actually going on in the state or in the city that you're making theatre in as well. And that doesn't just include, what's next on your subscription list. And it really pisses me off that I don't see a variety of people in those positions of having those positions of responsibility actually come and see a variety of theatre makers.
Yeah, I've had them come. I think there's a professional courtesy that sometimes is lacking. I always note it. I think I think people come because they want to see. I've always believed it was the writers' work, the voices, and then possibly the actors. Definitely, and often I encourage actors to make strong personal invitations because I'm not going to. But I say I'll support you and give you the tickets, but do it. And that's often why those people come along. I think it's great if they do. It's sad to think that people might give up catching a spark of brilliance in a young artist or an artist working outside their patch.
And I would have thought as well, like just being a theatre lover in general, if you read great things and you hear great things, wouldn't you want to see that? Wouldn't you want to go, I need to get in front of that?
Yeah.
Just to see a great piece of writing done really well.
Yeah, I agree. In a different space to the one that you work in.
In a different space to the one you're working in.
And also checking out who the audience is, like who are they missing out on or where are the crossovers? I'd say come and look at the audience because that's one thing we can all do is just say, oh, your audience is different to the one that we got with that show, or, oh, wow, comedies get a different sort of person. I think it's a research trip.
Professional curiosity.
Just the enjoyment.
Totally.
I think that's a fascinating point. I'm always fascinated by audience, and I'm always surprised on my shows. And I watch a lot of performances of shows that I direct, and part of it's to watch the show, but part of it I find the audience fascinating.
With Blackbirds, we've had a few artistic directors come through. One particularly come to quite a few of our shows, but we never invite anyone. You can buy a ticket. We fight to make our tickets cheap, so why don't you buy one like everyone else? Our show's going to sell out anyway. So no comps? We give comps to, you're not to artistic directors, no. Just to people who probably can't afford it or people who we've worked with before, family members,
Yeah, I found that it's varied as well, and I think it depends on the show, it depends on the content, it depends on, I do think that the playwright and the actors drive a lot of it. It could be what space it is, it could be if it's a new work or if it's it varies.
A quick yes or no, maybe we'll reverse our way back through the panel. Have you had a currently sitting artistic director in your audience ever, with the one exception of when you're performing the work in their space? So outside of that context, have you ever had a sitting artistic director come and see your show?
Yes.
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 So how do you think we, from our side of the fence, as indie theatre makers, tackle this problem of mobility and this sort of backlog that we're suffering, where we've got a lot of great artists that just aren't getting seen and aren't getting opportunities to progress upwards from indie theatre?
Maybe they don't want to go to why does everyone want to go to the mainstream?
Totally.
I'd go back to that question first. I think those structures are questionable at some really deep levels. I don't think it's the place where a lot of the people that I work with would want to necessarily go for artistic reasons. Maybe they want to go for financial reasons because we all like to be paid more for what we do. But, fees are not that high and wages are not that high. And if the work is thankless, then maybe it's not worth doing. I would just question the premise of your question is, do people want to go upward or do they want to go outward? I think people would like to be making more work in a way that's sustainable for them for bigger audiences. but where is that going to happen?
It depends on what sort of creative they are too, I think, and it's completely understandable. I was probably in this boat. Young actors, you're out of drama school and all that sort of stuff. They're looking at job prospects and all that sort of thing. But I find as you get older, you actually want to build your company more than anything. And I think that need to link it to any kind of main stage aspiration recedes.
It's just out. Yeah, certainly. I think as you get for me, as I've got older, it's less important.
Yes, but I understand a job's a job. And it's nice to
I respect that.
Get that
I totally respect that.
Wage. But in terms of creating a more upwardly mobile thing, if that's what everyone's into, I certainly think main stage could do, when we say main stage, we're talking about 4 or 5 companies. Yeah. I think some of them could do a lot more to bring indie companies maybe under their leadership flag or whatever you want to call it, or their umbrella. Doesn't Melbourne Theatre Company?
They tried that. It got very expensive. They had a dying audience. They had to do something about it, and they actually did something about it. They brought younger companies and younger audiences into their houses, but it just wasn't sustainable at the end of the day.
Empty theatres, though, when you've got empty theatres in these institutions, I don't understand that. It's
it is crazy.
And maybe I'm missing certain technicalities, and it's a lot harder than maybe I'm making out it to be. But a bit of support in that regard and audience sharing or creating wouldn't go astray.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you use the word mobility, because the artists are certainly moving between independent and funded, and so many wonderful directors, designers, and actors are moving between the two, because they independent is a great place to make work and to make work that you're passionate about. And there's a lot of collaboration as well. There's a lot of support, I think, increasingly I've experienced recently of resource sharing and generosity, both between independent companies but also across the sector. I agree that I think there's a broader conversation to be had about the sector and this idea that there is an up and down, because I think that's not the case for everyone. And I also think that the funding realities are becoming murkier, the governance structures are becoming murkier, and so I don't think we should get into it now, because we'll be here all day and we won't talk about anything else. But even being able to define what independent is these days is a can of worms if you try and draw neat distinctions. So I agree that I think that there's a broader conversation to be had.
We live in a small town, to be honest, and most of the work that's produced in the independent sector are not plays that will be sold at Sydney Theatre Company, because they simply can't sell enough tickets to support that play going on, regardless of its heritage or its brilliance as a work of literature or drama at all. The reality is that those bigger companies are around to sell tickets. We're there to make art.
And sell tickets.
Ooh, wow, Glenn McGrath.
Controversial. This sort of dovetails in slightly with what we've just been talking about in terms of the feeling that perhaps we're kind of stuck in whatever pocket of the industry we happen to be in. But at all levels, main stage and independent, theatre's often accused of being cliquey, of fostering environments where people come to work with a very selective group of people to perhaps the exclusion or the perceived exclusion of others. So it's true of most of the panel here today that you have collaborators that you prefer to work with, or I shouldn't say prefer to work with, that you have a working creative relationship with and that you work with frequently. What would you say in defense of this idea of having a creative clique? Do you think that it's all bad? What would you say to an artist who's trying to break into the industry and can only see these closed doors because of this perception of everyone already has the people that they want around them and there's no room for anyone else unless someone, pops their clogs or moves elsewhere or gives up? What would you say to those people that are fresh out of NIDA or fresh out of anywhere really and are looking at that industry and going, how do I break into Apocalypse or White Box or Siren?
Keep knocking on that door. Take something to the company that they want. I think that theatre is tribal. We're taught in drama schools that theatre's tribal. You meet your tribe, you stick with your tribe. You tend to create with your tribe because they know you. The tribe's always open to new members, but there's trials that they'll have to go through. I work with tribes. I love working with the same people. It's very much part of my process, but I always love to have somebody new in that process, either as a mentee, I guess, or somebody new in the creative group, whether it be an actor, hopefully an actor, and definitely part of the team. I don't think there's anything to defend about it. It just is. I think that if you want to break in your work, you need to be undeniable in your approach. Find the people that speak your language. Yeah, find out what they're about and see where you have a place inside that organisation? What can you take to them? Flattery is a great door opener.
It's a really hard thing to do, theatre. It's really, really, really hard, and it doesn't get easier. And for me, I have regular collaborators that I work with. What that allows me to do is it actually allows me to feel safe, to be honest, with these collaborators. I love working with those people. But I actually take offence at the fact that you were eyeballing me when you said regular collaborators working with the same people. Or maybe it's something that's just like boiling up in me. Because I am constantly looking for new artists to bring into the company, constantly looking for new creatives. I always have auditions for everything that I do. It's very rare that I don't have an open audition. So I'm always on the lookout for people that I feel will be the right, dare I say it, the right fit, or, you know, I can collaborate with on that particular project. And if I can't on that particular project, I'll make a point of searching them out and saying, perhaps not now, but I'd really love to work with you on this. It's coming up further down the track. So I feel that keeps me sparking as well. You know, not only do I appreciate the fact that I have collaborators that can talk my language, my shorthand, if you like, I also think it's really exciting when somebody comes in and they go, what the fuck are you talking about, Kim? You know, and I can go, yeah, what am I talking about? I guess I'm really searching for the best of both worlds, I guess.
Well, one of the questions I had for you, Kim, was in fact exactly that you are notable.
You're who Nate was talking about.
That's who he meant.
No one else here was that question directed to. I think he was calling you Miss Click earlier. It was so weird.
Click Hardwick.
Click Hardwick.
I feel like we're going to all leave and never talk to each other again after.
Okay, hit me with it.
But you do work with a lot of younger and emerging artists as a director, and that's obviously something that you, as you just have said, that you strive for. How important is it, do you think, for indie producers to make space for young emerging artists, particularly artists that don't necessarily come from a privileged entry point into the industry, that might not have come through somewhere like NIDA? How important is it, therefore, to have people like you who make those spaces for them, to give them a chance?
Holy moly, really important, I would think. I come from a regional town. Like, I grew up looking up to people that could make theatre, you know, in this tiny little town that I was in. And if somebody hadn't have turned around to me and gone, I think we're going to give you a chance, then I probably wouldn't even be here. And I had no training, nothing at that stage. So I think it's really important, actually, to look for those people and to actually positively prejudice, I would say, those people who don't come from a privileged, dare I say it, training background, you know, because you have gone to, you know, the big schools, you know, we all know what they are, but, you know, because you may have gone to those bigger sort of schools does not necessarily mean that you are going to be the best of the best. It just means that at that particular point in time, you were deemed to be right for entry into that institution. So there's lots of people out there that actually are wonderful creators and just need a bit of a spark, if you like, or a bit of a, you know, the door opening a little bit or whatever it might be. So I think it's really vitally important. But it's not just vitally important for us as indie creators, but for the whole sector.
Do you think that the inherent financial risks that already come with independent theatre making and producing deter producers from taking a perceived risk on an emerging artist that hasn't already had the chance to prove themselves elsewhere?
In my experience, no, it wouldn't deter me because it's just a risk regardless. There are very few times when I have, probably for all of us, actually looked at a sheet of paper and looked at the pre-production and gone, oh, it's a sure thing. It's a sure thing. You know? So for me, no, it's all a risk. So it doesn't matter.
Although
I agree.
I still feel like there is a certain, you know, certain actors or whatever have a certain cachet, don't they? Or a certain visibility that some producers will go, well, they might carve out an audience for the show or help at least.
I think that was very hot topic maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. I would often be pitching something and the first thing the AD would say to me is, who's your actor?
Really?
Yeah, like who what have they come from? What can we kind of leverage off them in terms of marketing? Yeah. I don't think that happens as much nowadays.
Yeah, I have a bit to say about this whole topic, if that's all right, which is,
Go for it.
I mean, I agree. I think that with the collaborators thing, that tension tension between working with people you know well and being open. You know, I think there is two sides to the coin. I think there is also a very practical thing that we don't have a lot of time. We are under-resourced, and so collaborations take time, and they take time to nurture. And if there's a particular style of work that you're doing, you know, for an example, if I'm trying to create a queer universe, that is a aesthetic that I can't develop easily with someone I'm working with for the first time necessarily. And also there's a dramaturgy to some of those things that we do, and a style and a tone and an aesthetic and all that. If you're working on new work, there's a whole different support system that comes with nurturing a new play into existence for the first time. And so there is, I think, a safety, also a practical reality to having collaborators. And also, I'm the type of artist who's excited by the idea that we continue to push each other's craft. I become a better director because of the rigor I have with my designers. The frequent designing collaborators that I have are the only people who are allowed to give me directing notes. They go, you haven't worked hard enough in this moment. But that's because I'm equally as rigorous with, I go, this is lovely, but what's it doing? So I think there's something exciting to me artistically about having a family of collaborators. I think the flip side of that coin is that we have a responsibility to have our eyes open and to not be a closed door. And I don't think we are. I think we see a lot of work. I think seeing work's important. That's how I often get excited by artists, whether it's actors or designers. I watch a lot, and I'll watch them over 2 or 3 years, and I go, oh, your past body of work is really interesting, and about doing open auditions where possible, and nurturing and developing your instinct. I think as a producer and director in the early years, I'd say you're more conscious about, what do people think about these actors and all that. As you grow to trust your instinct, I think you abandon that. I don't really care what anyone thinks about who I cast. If I know I'm right, I'll cast someone who's, as I just did, who came out of drama school straight into a show, and someone who's come from interstate or whatever it is. You learn to sort of trust your instinct. And it's something I've actually admired in both Kim and Kate for a while. You both in your casting you've never sort of succumbed to always casting the regular name. You've trusted your instinct. And I think as with time, we develop that instinct. So I think it's a dual thing. There's nothing to defend in having collaborators, but also acknowledging that we have a responsibility to be aware and to be open to new collaborators, which I think we all are.
Ayeesha, you're probably the youngest person on this panel in terms of your experience in the producing world. What is it that drew you to wanting to do this, to make your own work and produce your own work?
Well, Emily Unavule and myself, I went to opera and Emily went to NIDA, and when we both graduated, we had this moment at a bar when we realised that there was going to be no work for us that we would find fulfilling in terms of cultural representation, racial representation as women of colour, as women, as smart women, not just as stereotype. So we decided to make our own work. And that has been really empowering and very challenging. We have been really staunch on how we create our work and what work we put on stage. We only tell our stories because it's interesting the way that stories are told and who has agency to tell whose story. But if we tell our stories, then we're telling stories for our community and our family, and stories that haven't been told with our voices. So everything that we say is coming firsthand or from people who we have strong interactions with. So that also makes it very interesting in terms of collaborating with people, because we are on stage ourselves, or we've worked with 2 other women, Emily Havea and Angela Sullen, in Brown Skin Girl for 3 shows now. And then we have a resident choreographer, Stella Vi, who we've worked with for all of our shows as well. But when we're working together, we have to be able to trust that the person has the strength to tell their story, that they want to tell it, that they know how to tell it, that they've communicated properly with whoever that story is also a part of, and that they're able to write. And it's very different, putting your whole life on stage. We have no mask anymore. We're literally just ourselves, which is very strong but scary. And it's been really interesting, and that really changes the type of conversations that we have with theatre companies that we work with, because it's not like we're just putting on a Shakespeare. That's not how we do it. We've done the show that we recently did, we did it on opening night, and then we decided, oh no, actually we need to sit in the audience for the whole show. So you know what I mean? Like, we just change things on the spot, and people who we work with have to be able to adapt to that, and a lot of people can't if you're used to doing something that is so structured and a play that's been done 5,000 times before. Yeah, so it's really great, and we're careful as well to make sure that we work with women from a lot of different disciplines. So we throw events as well as putting on theatrical shows. Because something that I've really found as a POC in Sydney, POC community is really strong in creative practices in general, not in theatre, in music, in parties, like really strong. Like there's a artistic scene, like visual art. It's insane. So collaborating with people in those fields has really helped us build a stronger community and also encourage more people to come to our shows who wouldn't. Like a friend of mine came to a show the other day. He'd never been to the theatre in his whole life. He's 25. And another friend of mine, he came to another show and he was like, oh yeah, I love looking for an excuse to go to the theatre. I don't usually want to go because I don't feel comfortable, you know? And these are like really creative people who can't feel comfortable walking into a theatre. And why is that? Like Sydney has a lot to answer for, I think, in respect of that, because young people should feel comfortable. People of colour should feel comfortable. Anyone should feel comfortable, no matter what your income is, no matter what your postcode is. And at the moment, that's really not the case. Yeah.
Do you feel like the culture is starting to shift in the last couple of years?
I mean, I can't speak from any other perspective than my own. We're very careful to make sure that all our shows are financially accessible so that people can come, that they're close to train stations. Unfortunately, our last show was in a non-wheelchair accessible venue, but we're very careful in making sure that, you know, all our works in the future will be, because that's super important as well. But I mean, our shows, our audiences are always really diverse, apart from when you have like one subscriber night where you're like, oh God. But I can't... I can't speak in terms of any other... I mean, whenever I go to the theatre as an audience member, the past 2 shows that I've seen, I've been the only person of colour in the audience. And that makes me feel uncomfortable. And actually, two of the shows as well, there were no people of colour on stage. So I'm very aware of it. I don't know if anyone else is aware of it.
This will sound like a super obvious question, but you know, for the benefit of our wider audience, and who knows who might be tuning into this podcast, can you explain? You sort of touched on it already, but why it is for you, and particularly from your experience producing theatre with Blackbirds, why is it so important that theatre companies, particularly main stage companies, who can offer spaces and offer season programming and offer you those sort of resources that you don't have access to yourself necessarily? How important is it for them to actively make space for companies like you and for diversity and representation on their stages?
It's very important, but I think that there needs to be a rethinking in the way that support is given, because not necessarily saying, here, you can be in this theatre is actually helpful. To be honest, it's not helpful, because what if I'm going to be in this theatre, how much do I have to charge? $80? No one's going to come. I'm not going to go see my own show. Like, that's ridiculous. Who's going to come? Why would anyone want to come into this space? People don't feel comfortable. So maybe they can give support in another way. Maybe they can support a development. Maybe they can support a showing in a non-traditional theatre space. Maybe they can support something else. But just saying, here's a theatre space, it really doesn't do a lot. Obviously, money is great. Obviously, tapping into their thousands of email patrons is awesome. But at the end of the day, it feels uncomfortable. Like, actually, the Opera House is a slight tangent, but Opera House is programming a lot of black artists.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah, for the past year and a bit, right? Which is cool, but also like a tad odd. Because at the Opera House, when you're there, you have to just sit down in the seat, right? You can't get up. Like, they had Solange play, who's so, like, you know, black rights and empowerment, and in this space that is so historically white and is super upper class, it's just very odd. And I mean, it's maybe good clout for them getting more POC and etc. to the theatre, but it's also like, do the artists feel comfortable in that space? And do the people who want to go see those artists actually want to go to that space? Because I had friends who didn't go because they didn't want to go to the Opera House. You know what I mean?
But it does bring up, I mean, you bring up the notion of there being a lack of diversity in spaces.
Yeah.
You know, actually a lack of spaces, different kinds of spaces to create theatre. And I totally agree with that. You know, like, not only are there not enough, but there's just that notion of walking into the front door and going and sitting in your chair and all that kind of stuff, which most of the theatres are. And I'm not knocking that because I work in that. But I totally understand that there is a lack of different kinds of theatre for different kinds of theatre.
Yeah, and places where different cultures feel comfortable as well. Like, sometimes a community hall is great. It's a great space. Sometimes someone's backyard, someone's house. And that shouldn't like denigrate how people see the work, but I think it does. People are pretty elitist at times.
Yeah, I think, just to underline what you're saying, is there are audiences. One of the biggest issues we have in the theatre is access. What is the point of doing your show in a theatre where your audience cannot access it because of cost or location?
And they don't want to.
Or they just don't want to. Yeah. And this is such a huge part of my thinking now. I've been completely changed by things, and I can see this now. And so it's an important issue. And also, I just think as producers, we're also trying to find shows that fit the spaces we know are available. There's no point pitching a show to a space where it's just not going to be suitable.
Yeah, and ticket prices are expensive, and Sydney's also an expensive city to live in. These are practical realities as well. And I agree with Kim. I think if we had a diversity of spaces, we could. Yes, there are financial realities as well to why ticket prices need to be what they are. An independent, the bulk of our revenue is through ticket income.
Yeah, you need to pay people.
You need to, and that's where we're getting a bulk of our income from. But to be able to have the option, the choice to be able to create in different spaces where you could create in a more site-specific space where you can charge $15. But unfortunately, the legislation and the complex issues around legal activation of space in New South Wales is so far behind.
And that is such a killer. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and they literally said to me, "Oh, I saw this warehouse. Should go along and rent it." And I'm like, "Yeah, if only it was that simple. And let's create a theatre. My uncle's got a barn. Let's create a theatre."
Via
the
regulations.
complexity around it, is
people
enormous.
don't realise that. They don't. People always say to me, "Why aren't people making shows in warehouses or shop fronts?" And we're so far behind. And whilst we might have some really progressive local governments, such as the City of Sydney, a lot of these issues are state level when it comes to building code and to all of that. And so, it's a whole advocacy question as well about opening up space as an opportunity for artists.
And I suppose there are companies like Ayeesha, like you guys are sort of not letting that stop you in a way. And I suppose that independent ethos is kind of inspiring and it kind of encapsulates that, where you put on the work you want to see. And I think everyone, around this sort of little desk, we've all got our own tastes and our own opinions and our own backgrounds and our own cultural influences and all that. And I think that certainly influences the content and what we program and what we produce. But if the independent scene is there, if you can see people and companies like striking out on their own and striking out of the box and finding audiences that they can relate to and that are inspired by their work, I think that's a kind of brilliant aspect of the indie scene. And it's nice to see that that's not subsumed by main stage, let's just make theatre like we see on the main stages. And then it's all kind of just going to look the same.
I have a question because most of the companies represented here on this panel have ongoing relationships with particular venues that program your work. Is the work that you're choosing to offer up for programming influenced by the tastes of the people making those judgments on what they're going to program in that venue? Are particular venues curated by particular individuals who have their own personal tastes, kind of creating a homogenization of work because everyone who's trying to get their work on and find a space, because we have so few of them in the city, they're all pitching the same work that they think will please the same people. Do you think that is an issue?
I can see how you would think that is happening. Personally, I've had to argue for everything that I've had on the stage. So in a general sense, I suppose you could say a particular person is making the decisions about what goes into that venue, and therefore it will come down to, their particular taste. Yes, that's absolutely true. But in my experience, I've always been able to converse with those people, actually sit down and have a conversation with them about why I feel that this particular piece should be on at this particular time at this particular theatre. And mostly they disagree with me. But I just keep plugging away.
There are venues that have knocked back proposals from us that we've then taken to another venue
precisely.
and had a good run with. Had a great run. Yeah.
You just have to be dogged, I think, and
Do venues program, you think, based off box office return ultimately? Is that what they have to prioritise in programming?
I think if you have a good venue manager or artistic director, if that's what they call themselves, then that's part of the deal. Is that, they have a responsibility to get bums on seats in their venue. I understand that. But mostly the people I'm pitching to are people who are also interested in actually having a range of material in their venue.
I think it's an unfortunate byproduct of the lack of, the cottage industry that our theatre is.
Yeah.
There are absolutely little dominions in main stage and indie, and to be honest, I'm not really sure what the solution to that is.
No.
I mean, maybe Ayeesha's come closest to kind of solving that by going, going, all right, we're going to go into backyards, we're going to go into community halls.
How do we change the system in Australia? How do we foster a model that's closer to what you see in the US and the UK, where there's much more philanthropy from wealthy donors, there's much more corporate sponsorship. If you open a playbill on Broadway, the list of producing partners, of sponsors, of business interests that have a financial stake in that show is enormous. If you go to the UK, there are entire theatres that have essentially been funded to be built from the ground up by wealthy artists, including, big name stars like the Ian McKellens of the world. Whereas in Australia, you walk into our theatres like Belvoir or Griffin or those sort of places, and you see this huge list of names that are just largely general public or people that work in and around the arts who have literally had to sponsor this building brick by brick in these tiny little packet amounts to work up enough to even save or renovate a venue that we already have. How do we change that model? What's different here?
I feel like as a society, we don't really value artists. Government doesn't value artists. It doesn't value the arts. It doesn't really acknowledge the amount of money that the arts actually brings in terms of revenue that the arts generates. It's grown in the past year, yet the funding to the arts has been cut. So it really, there's no respect at the highest level. Even you think about when you're in high school and you do drama, they're like, oh, you're bludging, you're doing a bludge subject. It's why is that? It's in this ingrained in us as Australians that it's not worthy or it's not real. I was talking to someone from Belgium who's an artist, and he was saying that he comes back in here and he feels so sorry for his friends here who are artists because no one gets any respect and no one gets paid what they deserve. Whereas over there, he's like, he has a stable income. So I don't know how we fix it. I mean, election. Is
there ever going to be enough money, even if the government were to more heavily subsidise the sector and even potentially subsidise the independent sector? Is that ever going to be enough in and of itself to kind of create a change?
I don't think so. I think part of the problem, on a really basic level, is that we just don't have the population. And I know that sounds shitty because I would like to say that even with our smallish population in relationship to England or United States, that there are people who could slice off a chunk of their income and donate it to the arts. But I think that the greater the population, the more likely those people are that they can be found. And I think that's part of the problem on a really, really simple level.
No, it is traditional that the fields that we work in are the less well supported, probably because it looks like everybody could do it. Whereas everybody knows they can't dance in a tutu.
Well, while we're on the topic of funding, I have quite a few questions.
That's my theory.
Quite a few questions in my list here that sort of revolve around how money works in the independent sector. Because there's a bit of a mystery to people that don't work inside of it, that people look in and go, how is this industry working? How is it sustainable? How are these people still going? So I might start with a specific question to you, Kate, and then jump over to Jeremy because I've got a very similar question that will dovetail into it. But Kate, you usually pay your artists an upfront fee on top of the usual profit share arrangement. And that fee, I hope you don't mind me saying, is almost on par with some main stage companies. It's not a nominal amount. It's quite a significant fee. First of all, what's your reasoning behind that? And how do you actually make that a financially viable model for your producing?
Probably the quick answer is experience. Just to reflect on your question, it surprises me that subsidised companies pay so low. I'll leave that one there. My upfront fees actually reflect what I believe is possible against what I believe I will at my projected income through the box office and other sources, including grants. In some cases, and I put this out there because in some cases, as a producer, this is my choice, it may reflect a creative relationship, its depth, length, etc. Mm-hmm. But mostly, I hope that it reflects the respect, trust and the value of each artist that I collaborate with. People are the greatest resource that we have in the theatre. Everything else can be begged, borrowed or stolen. And I think that not exclusively, but mainly my, physical environment aesthetic is very light on because I believe in putting money into the artists and how we use the space. The other thing I do is I exercise incredibly strict budget control. So I think I'm a good producer in that sense. I'm a good negotiator. If I can get it cheaper, I will because I want to pay people. And I think for me, being a producer, it's the same being any kind of artist, but being a producer is about managing risk. Sometimes, for me, a budget is how much am I prepared to lose? And I manage my resources accordingly.
I'm going to bounce off that to Jez with a question that's going to sound prickly, but I want to put a disclaimer.
I'm going to storm out if
you and I
this
worked
is called
together
an ambush.
many times.
It's only a matter of time before he
This
gets
is not
to the rest
a
of it.
reflection on my experience with you or anything like that. So, as we know, independent theatre largely works off the notion of this profit share system. And the guiding principle of that is that everyone's an equal shareholder taking an equal risk for an equal return at the end of the day. But it's fair to say, and this is why I throw this question to you, when you have a particular production like The Flick that you produced last year, where there's a certain design element within that show that necessarily has to be significantly bigger than the others, so the set in that instance for that particular show, that necessitates that department eating up a much more sizable chunk of the budget, which then, of course, throws this whole idea of kind of equity in terms of the money in these productions out the window a little bit. It's also, and this is definitely not true of you, but it's also built into the MEAA guidelines for independent theatre and their contracts. They suggest as a template that any change to budget expenditure should technically be run by the entire team, all the artists that have a stake in that show, whose profit is potentially eaten into by deciding to go over budget in a particular area. But that's very, very, very rare to actually see that done. Speaking from experience, that's quite unusual to see. So given those problems that are inherently there, is the notion of profit share inherently sort of flawed in independent theatre?
I just think the notion of profit share needs to be questioned. Because I don't work on profit share. I mean, who works on a true profit share?
Well, this is the thing. And even this whole, and when you say their investment, I'm like, I don't know, I've never asked an actor to invest in one of my shows. The financial risk is mine.
Yeah, I agree.
And only mine. And there's a little part of me going, well, you know, that design budget has been paid for by moi, but I also understand, because I'm an actor. Like, I've been doing independent theatre for literally probably 20 years, and I think the most I've ever got from an independent theatre gig as an actor, it'd shock you. Like, and I think when you've come up through those ranks yourself, like, you know what it's like. And I certainly have been sensitive in the past as an actor when you're getting literally nothing and then the production team comes in and everyone's getting paid and you're going, well, hold on, well, hang on, the lighting budget's kind of suddenly blown out. And again, I've been rehearsing for 6 weeks and then I'm also in the show for the next 3. So in terms of an hourly investment to work on this show, I'm probably kind of up there as an actor. So I do keep that in mind in terms of payment, and I like to think that the actors get a good crack at, what pie there is.
Is it fair to say as a producer you expect to walk away with either nothing or so break even or even in debt from a show?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't want a budget to lose, to be honest. I've rarely produced where I haven't at least made my money back. I think, again, it's a really prickly thing because you're like, well, hold on. If we're actually just going to come out of this with no money, like, where's our future going to come from? Like, if I keep losing a big chunk of change on every show, my company will cease to exist.
Do you use the profit, if there is one, from past productions to fund the next production?
There's never really much in the kitty. Sometimes there's been a little bit left that, yes, goes straight back into the company that we can then look at sustainability. I prefer the model where you pay your creatives a fee, because if you and I hear this line from some independent producers where they go, oh, no, we're all about profit share. It's like, man, you're not going to make, at the very least, you're going to make a very negligible profit. So if you're just going to chain people to a profit share arrangement, they're not going to make a hell of a lot. And then you're also, as a creative, you're putting a lot of faith in the producer to say how much they spent and what their budget was and how much they've made of that budget back. A shady producer might cook those figures or whatever and go, sorry, guys, you've all made $10.
I have a number with the design. So I have the rule where I will not ever exceed this number. And if I do, I have to donate it to the production. Design is central to how I work. It's central to how I direct. Depending on the work as well, it does depend on the work as to what you want to do with the vision for it. I mean, Angels in America was a very design expensive show. But once I hit my number, everything else I had to foot the bill on. So I make choices around that number.
And ask a quick rapid-fire question to the panel. Maybe we'll start with you, Dino. What percentage of audience do you tend to budget to for your break-even?
Oh, good question. It depends on the venue. It depends on the work. If it's a new work, I would budget a different percentage. That's just my experience. And if it's a play that people know. Look, it depends on it. I mean, for Angels in America, I budgeted on 80% capacity. That's ridiculous. But it's a small venue. It's that play. It was, But then there are other works where you might go, you know what, I have to budget on 40, even though I think I might get 60 or 70 or whatever. I think it's about, as has been said already today, it's about managing how much risk you're willing to take.
Yeah.
And also, experience counts for a lot. You do enough work and you do work in enough venues, and you kind of know where the budget's going to land, roughly. Like it's never a sure bet that you're going to get audience, or suddenly there could be a freak winter and no one's going to the theatre.
Or an election.
You know.
Or the Twin Towers. I had a romantic comedy that opened the night after the Twin Towers. Sorry, it is all context. It's ticket price in venue. It's the program that you're in. It can be time of year. It can be the zeitgeist. It can be its political content. But between 35 and 45 is about right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be what I would recommend producers pitch at. Yeah.
Ayeesha, how about, because your work's quite different in the sense it's not always in a very traditional space. And,
it changes venue, show, and also it changes throughout the process. So as in when we start advertising it till 2 weeks before the show opens, then we realise, oh, cool, we can budget this for 100% sold out. We'll just go with the flow, to be honest. Yeah, and just ride the wave and
percentages.
Yeah, see what happens. I mean, whenever that's happened as well, we've also found all these hidden expenses pop up, So the universe has a funny way of working, really.
Fine print.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I know. Isn't it always the way? Yeah.
You're like, I couldn't. Oh no,
you had to
couldn't.
catch that taxi.
Yeah,
twice.
GST.
I don't think people understand rights. Like when you tell people what you pay for rights, sometimes
Oh no, they don't.
They're like, what?
They don't get it. I don't get
You
it.
spent
No, I
that
do get
before
it.
you started anything?
Yeah.
Kim, what about you?
Yeah, I agree with Kate. Between 35 and 45. I can't remember the last time I budgeted for over that, but that kind of bums on seats capacity.
Yeah, ditto.
And I don't know where I'm going with this, but a budget is never the reflective of the true cost of the production.
No.
And the value of contra, hard and soft, and also the invisible subsidy of the artists on the project, which we don't talk about. I think if we actually all did a budget of what our shows would have cost under full circumstances, I don't know where I'm going with that, but I think it is important to recognise that the numbers on paper are not reflective of actually what it takes to get the show up.
I just finished a show on Saturday night for a company that had received subsidy to create the work, but at the bump out there was the chair of the board and his family, the general manager and her family. There are people that pitch in and help out because they want to help out. If you put a dollar figure on all of that, even with a subsidised company, it would still be more than anyone could afford to do. Yeah.
Kim, a question for you. You spent a bit of time away from the theatre industry and have relatively recently made a return to producing and directing. Have you observed a change in the independent sector in that time? For you coming back into it, has there been anything that surprised you or that you've really found of note?
Yes, it's, and I have to say I wasn't away for forever.
Well,
I think it was maybe 5-6 years, which it could be a lifetime, really. It could be. Yes, it's much, 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 much more competitive. And I think that that's good. I think that's really good. I think that there are many more voices that are involved. Not enough, but still many more voices than when I kind of departed before. I'm going to say, but I'm not sure if this is true, but I think it comes back to what we were saying earlier on about how the quality of work is so much stronger because maybe it is more competitive. Yeah, I guess that's... I think people indie scene is taking on bigger plays, taking on bigger issues than it was a number of years ago, not afraid to tackle things that are actually at the core of what might be happening now, or that maybe not traditionally, but maybe in the past somebody's read a play and gone, oh, we couldn't possibly do that because it's too big, whatever that means. Now you tend to find that is something that you see continually, that, indie companies or indie productions are out there taking on very fresh international works, for example, or taking on works that actually are of a particular genre or a particular group of people or whatever it may be. The kind of mundaneness, if you like, or the general sort of aspect of flatness of it, I think has dissipated slightly. But I don't know, maybe you've got something to say about that because you didn't go away.
Yeah, look, I think more people have access to producing and creating their own work. It's become a huge part of our culture, and that is reflected in some of the policy that's created for government. And I think when it gets to government level, it means that it's made a wave. And there have been discussions, I believe, about how to support this very vibrant sector. So that's been true, and I've seen that since I've been in Sydney, that really develop.
A quick, let's call it a yes/no answer. This one, real simple. Do you see yourself still producing work under your company's banner in 10 years' time?
Depends what day it is.
I'll jump in there. Yeah, depends what day it is. But I'll say probably yes, because if I was not going to do it, I would have stopped by now. Now, who's to know what's actually going to happen in the future? I don't know. I might get hit by a bus as soon as I just leave these doors. And then
Don't put that in.
You might be an AD. You might be an AD.
Yeah, you might become a gatekeeper.
Yeah.
You've been watching too much television, Kate. I guess because I love it, I'm not saying it's not going to evolve in some way and change. And, like I may not actually direct all the things that are going to happen in my company. I actually really love that. But I see no reason for White Box to not exist. That's my short answer to that.
It's good that there's passionate answers, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yep.
Oh, you were all so good.
You did the talking for us.
You did the heavy lifting.
On behalf of all of us, thank you, Kim.
What she said.
Another quickfire question. What's more important in your experience as producers, a big production budget or a big marketing budget?
Neither.
Neither.
No, neither. I would agree with that.
Yeah, simply put, I would say neither. Yes, that's all I'm going to say.
I tend to think the same. But at the end of the day, creating a good show, a really good show, is the most important thing if you want to get buzz out there and get bums on seats.
To answer that, I don't think either of those things are the most important guiding principle, but I do say when I do my producing course, please look out for it, it's a weekend each year, people often say, if you have money, would you employ an assistant producer or would you employ a publicist? And I say, I have never produced a show without a publicist, so therein lies your answer.
Have any of you ever regretted a production that you've produced?
Yes.
Look,
God
if you
damn
want
it,
to, if you want to elaborate, I'm happy to hear
And
it.
now you have to name it.
This is the follow-up
name
pub
and shame.
conversation. Yeah, totally.
Now I have to name what the production was and why.
Of course
And
not.
which
You think
artists
I'm
were
an idiot?
involved.
Of course I'm not going to say that. No, yes, I have regretted, but I have to say it actually wasn't because of the artist I was working with. It was because of me. Like I stuffed it up, so I have regrets about that. But having said that, also, like if I hadn't have done that and stuffed it up, this is what I say to the students that come to me asking for advice. If I hadn't have done that, if I just hadn't have done something, then I wouldn't have known that I'd stuffed it up. Do you know what I mean? At least I could reflect back and go, well, that was really pretty terrible. And then let's move on to the next thing. That's where I stand on that.
No.
No.
I'm going to say no.
If you could identify what the most pressing concern for you as an artist and as a producer for the independent sector, if you could address one topic or one issue that is important for you as a producer, what would you name that as being?
Accessibility is a big one for me.
Yeah, definitely accessibility.
And when you say accessibility, audience accessibility?
Yeah, in all forms,
yeah.
Financial, geographical, physical.
That often our theatres aren't in places where the audiences are, and now the fear of going out to those audiences.
Mine would be a venue, and we hear about it all the time, but that's probably tied into that. It's
think it is,
probably a lack
yeah.
of venues. Don't know how to solve it.
I think it is tied into that. I would say access as well, and access for audiences, access on stage and representation of on stage, but also creatives. And I think we've started some representation conversations, such as gender and diversity, but there are other conversations to have. I think we've got a very ageist theatre culture. I think that I'm talking about on the stage and in the creative roles.
Yep.
I think we've got big issues to look at around disability. I think even with queer voices, there's a lot of communities that are not being represented. So representation in that respect, and also then access for the audience, because I don't think theatre is going to be sustainable when a certain generation starts dying and we haven't addressed who's coming and how are they getting there. As in, can they afford to come? All the issues we've been talking about. The independent sector, I think, and I get this is my reality too, where we're so focused on keeping up with the next thing. We've just got to do the show that we're currently doing or think about the year we're currently in. It's very difficult for us as a sector to invest a lot of time and energy into thinking ahead.
Into having the time to be strategic costs money. I would love to be doing 5 or 6 shows a year where I could address some of the things that really matter to me. I just can't. I can't. I don't have the energy.
You could with your own venue.
If I had a stream of income, if I had subsidy, and I think subsidy is what makes those things happen, it's just really tough. Yeah, it's really tough.
To end on a slightly more upbeat note for each of you, we might go around the panel. I'd just love to hear, I'm sure you've touched on a lot of it in the course of this discussion, but what is it ultimately that gets you out of bed and gets you emptying your not necessarily very deep pockets into these productions, into this industry? What keeps you motivated?
The sound of the audience clapping at the end.
Community.
The work for me. I think theatre gives me somewhere to place my rage, to be honest. I joke to people that if I stop being angry, I'll stop directing. Because I think it's a place where I work things out, and this tribal nature, this community thing that we have with artists making work, but also what happens when people sit in front of it. And there's this thing you can't describe of what happens in the room without being sort of, over the top. It is one of the last communal rituals we have where a disparate group of people come together. And I think that's exciting to me because it's always surprising too.
I totally agree with that. I'm a socially very awkward person. I'm unbelievably shy and insecure and have a very big lack of worth in myself. And I think theatre for me is about placing some kind of sense of voice out there for people to share in that, for them to look at that and reflect on that, because I don't think that I'm necessarily the only person that feels like that, but the craft that I have actually allows that sense of community and communion, and that's really kind of what keeps me going. I was thinking about this today, actually. I thought it might be a question that you might ask. I thought if I was Nate, what would I ask?
Am I becoming obvious?
For me, quite similar. I love that word communion. It's great writing and the way that great writing can trigger empathy and theatre's very, very unique ability to do that, to trigger empathy using words and stories and bodies in a communal space, reaching for those blissful moments where it all comes together and the planets align and the audience and the performers and the story all align. And something shifts in all of them.
And that's really bliss. It's bliss for the creators. It's bliss for the audience. And you don't get that anywhere else. Yeah, there's really nothing like it. And it doesn't mean to say it's not going to transform. It's not going to shift the way that happens, but, that's what we're all really ultimately emptying our pockets for.
We live in very complicated times. That's what I mean by placing the rage somewhere. There's so many things, you can't turn on the news or anything without being enraged by something, I find. But there's a distilled humanity. It doesn't mean that every piece of theatre is going to be positive and reflecting a rosy picture of the world, but there's something about it. It's humanity, the humanity at its core that I think is extraordinary.
Well, thank you all for coming onto this panel.
Nate.
It's been lovely having you on, hearing your experiences and hearing your wisdom and discussing some of these issues in a sector that I think for a lot of people is a bit of a mystery, that we enjoy the work that's created, but I don't think a lot of people necessarily, if they're not artists themselves, understand how it comes to be and the great risk and passion that has to lie behind that. So thank you for coming on board and sharing that with us. Thank you for tuning in with this very special panel discussion and for joining our growing community of cunts. For those of you who have been with us since the beginning, a huge shout out from Susie and I. And if this is your first visit, then do be sure to go back and check out our earlier episodes. The action continues next week when we will be interviewing 2 very special guests, fresh from closing night of A Little Piece of Ash. This has been Nate Edmondson and the silent but vengeful spirit of Susie Wrong for Closing Night Theatre Therapy. Subscribe to our podcast at all your favourite outlets, including Spotify, iTunes and YouTube. If we are missing from your favourite platforms and apps, do let us know and we'll make sure we make ourselves available. As always, you can follow us on social media to keep in touch. You'll find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Our handle is CNTT Podcast. Like us, love us, but don't troll us. We're all here to make the world a better place. Or, as I like to say, be a cunt, not a cunt. Catch you next week. Until then, goodbye.